Well, good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. Barry Jones with SP History, and we are beginning chapter 5. And the topic of this series is the formation of the deep state. In chapters 1 through 3, if you go back and watch, we talked about the ultra vires principle, the governing principle, the rise of corporations. Of course, that became law in the form of the Ultra Vires Act, stipulating that corporations exist for one reason and one reason only, and that is to maximize profits. It is not there, these corporations do not exist to take into consideration the public interest. In fact, as a matter of review, if you were found as part of the governing uh, board or the CEO or a manager or anyone affiliated with the corporation, if you were found to be acting or taking even into consideration the public interest when making decisions about the corporation, you could be fired for cause. I will probably start off every chapter or every episode reviewing ultravires because it is absolutely crucial to understand that, to understand why the government begins making decisions in the way that it does going forward. We assume incorrectly that the government has the public interest in mind. And as long as it stayed separate from the corporation and the CEOs and ultravires, an argument could be made that it did. But at some point, these two interests are going to merge. And we see it already taking place. Now, not officially, because they haven't been invited in yet. That'll happen in World War I, World War II, when they become the de facto government, these corporate heads and this ultra-vires doctrine. But they still have influence even before that because they're making all the campaign contributions. In other words, they own the politicians. So though they are not on the inside making the decisions officially, from the outside, they're funneling all this money to Washington and buying these congressmen, these senators, and even these presidents to do their bidding. So very important to understand. It's all about profits. It's not about public interest. And then the second part of it is that they are completely immunized personally and corporately. And it's written right into the law. And no one acting on behalf of the corporation could be held liable for just about anything. So that immunized you personally, but corporately, you could hide your profits from the tax man. You could hide your assets from lawsuits, and it was perfectly legal. And so corporations were built to exploit people. Corporations were built to get fabulously wealthy, grow, become enormous, uh, and bigger and more powerful than even the government. And so why are we surprised that that's exactly what happened? Why are we surprised that they took advantage of the unfit population, those that were working to make the fit, the owners, uh, rich and powerful? And when you look at the world through that lens of social Darwinism, it gives you all kinds of permission to exploit and take advantage and mistreat and discriminate. You use the verb. You can do anything you want to people, and it's justified. And so that became a very handy tool to use on your way to the top, so to speak. So uh, part of my channel involves uh, explaining the transition from this treachery that we see from these corporate heads to treason. Because what we've described so far isn't treasonous. It's capitalism run amok. It's greedy, it's selfish, it's exploitive, it's discriminatory, uh, it's certainly not humanitarian, you know, but it's not treasonous. And in my first episode, I defined the difference between treachery and treason. And of course, treachery is when you betray people and you deceive people and for personal gain, right? That's what we see. Treason is when you betray the country, you betray the American people, you overthrow the government, or you kill the king, or in our case, the president, which in effect overthrows the government. So what we're going to be seeing as we uh, talk today is the first evidence of treachery becoming treason. And it's sort of a tepid uh, attempt, but it's so successful, it works so well, it becomes a template going forward. So it's very important to understand this war, the Spanish-American War, how it started, how it got its start, the motives behind it, who was behind, like Geppetto pulling the strings. It's very important to understand that because, and how it happened. Because it, like I said, it becomes a template going forward. And I've seen this template repeated over and over and over. Uh, you know, I'm I've seen it in the last few years happen at least twice. And so this the study of history helps you understand patterns. And once you understand patterns, it helps you better understand, comprehend what's going on today, especially if the pattern's being repeated again and again. And you realize, okay, this isn't what we're being told. This is part of this pattern. So let's talk about the beginning of this war. Uh, and the enemy here is going to be Spain, but it's not really about Spain. It's about Cuba for us. Cuba sits, and my goodness, we're going to reach into the 60s, 70s today, 19 of the 20th century, to help explain what happened back here in the Spanish-American War. And the issue will still be Cuba. It will still be Cuba 100 years later. You know, it sits 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And more importantly, its tropical climate is perfect for growing sugarcane. And we learned yesterday in our theft of Hawaii, uh, the industrialists led by Sanford Dole, and but no doubt there were other fruit company, United Fruit, you know, California Fruit Company, and Dole Pineapple, all these U.S. companies that need these tropical climates and the indigenous peoples to perform all the labor um, want to lay claim to these places. It's good for business, good for the bottom line. And again, remember now, they don't care about the people, the public interest. It's all about profits. And so Cuba is at this time a colony of Spain. And we have uh, sugarcane and other fruit companies that are interested in doing the same thing to Cuba we did to Hawaii. In fact, it would even be better because it's closer. The problem is Cuba is not an independent country. We can go in and just quickly overthrow with the Marines like we did in Hawaii. It is controlled by a major power, Spain. So our issue is with Spain if we want to get our hands on Cuba. Now, the Cubans don't like being a colony of Spain, as is always the case. And they've rebelled several times, but and the Spaniards always come in and crush the rebellion. But it's just an ongoing thing. But the Cubans will never be able to succeed without outside help in freeing themselves from the Spaniards. And they know it, everybody knows it. The Spaniards were extremely harsh in their treatment of the Cubans. You can see here pictures of dead bodies piled up after the latest rebellion. Um, and there was a real appetite in Cuba for a rebellion that would succeed. They'd seen all these failures. Boy, it should be nice if we could succeed. And so there was a movement, an underground movement in Cuba. It was just ongoing, Cuba Libre, or Free Cuba from the Spaniards. And this is our opportunity right here. Um, American businessmen had $50 million, which doesn't sound like a lot today. Back then, that's a lot of money, wrapped up in sugarcane plantations in Cuba. So we have a vested interest in whatever happens to Cuba. And not only was it a good place for growing sugarcane, which is the natural resource needed for sugar processing. It was also a growing market, at least we viewed it as a growing market potentially for U.S. goods. Now remember, imperialism had five causes. A, we needed access to raw materials or natural resources. Cuba fit the bill. B, we needed access to the markets. Here again, Cuba fits the bill. There's people there, potential customers for U.S. products. We also wanted to control foreign territory so we could put bases for our military. One of our largest bases today is in Guantanamo in Cuba, so we can maintain our stranglehold on our empire that is growing by the day. Uh, Four was those were the first three causes. The fourth cause was we'd run out of our own frontier, and we needed foreign territory to serve as a release mechanism or a pressure release for Americans looking to expand into foreign territory and start over on somebody else's frontier. Cuba is only 90 miles from the coast of Florida, so it's close enough to serve that interest. And then fifthly, because of our belief in social Darwinism, if we don't take Cuba, somebody else will. And right now, somebody else has it, the Spaniards. You know, here's this European power meddling in our hemisphere, 90 miles off our coast. That is going to be a problem, a continuing problem going forward for the next 150 years. So anyway, the Americans began thinking of ways to help the Cuban people free themselves from the subjugation of the Spaniards, with the idea that then we can come in through the back door, having earned Cuban people's gratitude for helping that free them from the Spaniards, and now we can turn it into sort of like a Hawaii South, right? We've got Hawaii out west, and that's on its way to becoming a state after we stole it. Cuba could be Hawaii too. So, but we're going to have to convince the American people we've not fought any foreign wars. Remember, George Washington said, don't do it. Stay out of foreign entanglements. So we're going to have to convince the American people, which has largely been isolationists for its entire history, to want to take up the cause. So this is where the media comes in. We talk all the time about the captured media today and Operation Mockingbird, the CIA effort to control the media, which is ongoing, by the way. This predates the CIA, folks. This is back in the 18th century, right? Or no, I'm sorry, the 19th century, the 1800s. So basically, most of our media was owned by two men. Two publishing empires, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, Pulitzer and Hearst. And these publishers became wholly owned subsidiaries, basically, of the United States government, which of course is a wholly owned subsidiary, as we've learned, of these big corporatists, these robber barons, these power elites, these 50 to 60 men who run the U.S. economy, run all these companies, run the U.S. economy, and basically run Washington with their campaign donations. So they're all run by the same people. And their purpose in this Spanish-American War effort was to print what we call yellow press, to sensationalize headlines and stories, put pictures on the front pages of Spanish atrocities that would gin up American sympathies for the Cubans, inflame public opinion. It's propaganda is what it is. It has a purpose. Its purpose is to enrage the American people sufficient enough to push it across the midfield line and into enemy territory and say, okay, we've always historically been against getting involved in foreign wars. I mean, most famously in the French Revolution, when John Adams probably lost re-election in his stand. He was very, the French were very felt very betrayed when John Adams, the United States, would not help France, the French Revolution. Um, because Adams accurately said this is a revolution, which means it's a war amongst the French. We're not going to get involved. They tried to bring the British into it and get the Americans to support the French. And Adams says, no, 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 we're not doing that. George Washington said, stay out of foreign entanglements. Now, the French were mad because they had helped us in our war against the British. They say, you owe us. But, I mean, this was in our DNA to stay out of foreign entanglements. So this ain't going to be tricky. We've got to lay the groundwork with the press. And every morning, American people are going to read these newspapers from Pulitzer and Hearst, and there's going to be this march, this drumbeat to war, as we constantly barrage the American people with all this propaganda about the Spanish. And uh, so this you see is part of the strategy. This is not new. This is not a 20th century phenomena or a 21st century phenomena. This has been going on for a very, very long time, to use the news media to propagandize the American people. Because in America, you need popular support for whatever you're going to do. And so we're using the media here to try to change public opinion to support something that in the past would not have supported. Now, this still is not treasonous, right? Even though technically what they're printing is not accurate. It's yellow press. It's off color. It's propaganda, but it's being done by private interests. Pulitzer and Hearst are not the government. These are private industries. You can choose to pay the money for the newspaper or not. You can choose to be propagandized or not. So this is technically private industry, the private sector, propagandizing the American people. Of course, we know that the private industry in this case is being controlled by these power elites who have an agenda. And so this is the beginning of this process. When you do this, it plays into this, it's a word we call jingoism, which is this rally around the flag kind of a mentality where your country can do no wrong and you can criticize your own. It's sort of like family pride. You know, you've seen this a million times, I'm sure, where brothers and sisters fuss and feud with one another, but somebody outside the family comes in and attacks a member of the family, and then we're fighting words. The family all of a sudden rallies and they present a united front. That's jingoism. It applies in a family setting. It also applies nationally. We can criticize our president till the cows come home, but somebody from outside the country do it, and then we're fighting words. You don't see it. It doesn't seem to be as strong today as it was when I was growing up. Anyway, right on cue, this yellow press released a letter that they said was from the Spanish ambassador. And in this letter, which they printed, it called President McKinley, our president, a quote, weak and stupid politician. This was printed in one of Hearst's papers, the New York Journal. And of course, it was picked up all across the country. And the American people were furious. Now, the American people have been primed like a pump, like you're priming your gas tank on your lawnmower so you can start the mower. The whole purpose here is to get the American people to support a foreign war against Spain. So the yellow press has been printing story after story, pictures on the front page, propagandizing the American people how bad Spain is and how vulnerable Cuba is. And Cubans are, and it's right off our coast. We should, if we were the humanitarians we claim to be, we should go down there and help these poor Cubans. And it's just been, it's like Chinese water torture, drip, 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 drip. And the support is growing and the antagonism towards Spain is growing. And then right when the Americans are close to being over the 50-yard line, where majority of people support this war, you print this letter. Now, it was never proven. It was never proved that this letter was legitimate. Of course, the Spanish ambassador came out and denied he ever wrote such a letter and would never have insulted the American president. But the damage was done. The American people, which had been led down this road to think the Spanish were these evil people and they committed all these atrocities against Cubans, were capable of something like this. We already believed they were capable of it. We already believed they were bad. And so they were the boogeyman in that particular era. And now we have an insult by one of their leaders against our president. And the American people are, by this point, foaming at the mouth. Today we would call this a psyop. And this is sort of what the CIA specialty is, to use psychological warfare against the American people to bring them to heel, to march them in lockstep towards a destination that they want us to go, where they want us to go. And that's what's happening. And so we sent a battleship down called the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect American citizens in Cuba. Now, everybody knows, because we've seen this happen so many times, as soon as you send American forces or any sort of American, you know, whether it be a ship or soldiers or tanks or planes, into harm's way, something bad is usually going to happen, and that's going to be all that's needed, a pretext, a justification for war. But it's even worse than that, folks. It's not us sending it in harm's way, hoping something bad will happen that will be the final nail in the coffin for Spain and get us into this war. It's that we're going to make sure something bad happens. Now you say, well, wait a second. What does that mean? Well, we'll get into it, but let's just tell what happened first. Ostensibly there were, with all these American companies down in Cuba with these sugar plantations, there were American citizens there, and these power elites had sent a ship down so we could put our families on that ship, send them back home, get them out of harm's way, like they knew something was about to happen, right? So this is right on the heels of that letter being published in U.S. newspapers. We send the USS Maine down. It's parked out in Havana Harbor, and on one morning, it was in nighttime, the Maine exploded. 266 officers and crew died. And of course, the natural explanation is that the Spaniards did this. We sent our ship into their colony. It's parked off Havana Harbor, and it was an aggressive action on our part. This is the explanation. And so they blew up our ship and killed a bunch of American naval officers and crew. And so clearly, we have ourselves a situation. We understand what the media's role in this is. The media's role through the yellow press was to propagandize the American people into thinking Spain bad, Cuba good. And after enough time has gone by sufficiently, whereas this public support for U.S. intervention has raised to a point where we're getting close, they published this letter accusing the Spanish ambassador of insulting our president. And it taps into this jingoism. And more people now are supporting a U.S. intervention. And now we have an act of violence. I mean, it's like, we have if you just look at this on its face and you give the United States the benefit of the doubt, you say, well, these are just circumstantial events that happened. Spain is proving what we thought that they were. And so now it's our decision, it's our choice. It's on us now to decide what we're going to do about it. If we're the power we think we are, we're not going to stand for our president being insulted. We're not going to stand for our ship being attacked, U.S. servicemen being killed. And it's one thing to want to rally to help a foreign country who's being, exploited and taken advantage of and persecuted by a foreign power. That's really not our business. But this is our business. And so right on the heels of that, the rallying cry becomes the remains of the ships. at the bottom of the harbor there. Remember the Maine becomes the battle cry. And April 19th, 1898, 2 years before the millennial there, Congress declares war on Spain. And we'll get into the Teller Amendment tomorrow, but I want to focus my attention on this incident with the USS Maine. We know for a fact, and to do that, I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to put up some documents here so that you can see. If I can figure this out here. All right, American imperialism, there we go. All right, here we go. All right, we are not going to learn the truth about what happened with the USS Maine for many years. In fact, we're not going to learn it until the 70s, specifically 1975, when the church hearings take place. The church hearings are an examination of the intelligence operations in America because we've just come through several assassinations, JFK in 63, MLK and RFK in 68. We've come through Vietnam. There's a lot of suspicion at Watergate. There's a lot of suspicion as a result of the investigations into these events that our intelligence operations in America have been running amok. And so this was a specific investigation to look into the CIA, the FBI, et cetera, and determine if we have rogue elephants operating as intelligence operations here in America that are unaccountable, unelected, and and have committed treason. In other words, they participated in some of these assassinations. They participated in the overthrow of the Kennedy government. They participated in the creating a war for their purposes, the Vietnam War, which killed 58,000 American men. So that it's treason. In this investigation, it's one of the rare times where we got an inside look into these agencies because two consecutive CIA directors, neither one of which lasted very long for obvious reasons, turned over all the internal documents. They call them the family jewels. And we got to see what the CIA and what the government had been up to, and the FBI had been up to in their own words. It was their own documents. In other words, we weren't speculating. This wasn't a whistleblower making an accusation. This wasn't an eyewitness or somebody who was a disgruntled former employee or whatever. These are their own documents. So this happens in the 70s. Now, what we're going to do, this is 1970s. But as a result of these documents, we're going to learn something about what happened in 1898 with respect to the beginning of the Spanish-American War. So hold on to your, and none of this has been taught in history textbooks. All right, so they're looking at all these documents and they come to this operation, which is called Operation Northwoods. This was proposed to the Kennedy government in 1963, shortly before he died. And it was a joint CIA and Joint Chiefs, which means the U.S. military is involved in this. It was a plan to commit state-sponsored acts of terrorism on American soil against American citizens. In other words, our government was proposing to attack American citizens, kill American citizens on American soil, and then set it up in such a way that it looks like Cuba did it. Here we are. This is 1963, the proposal to Kennedy, and we're still obsessing over Cuba. 70 years later, after our first attempt to take over Cuba. Some of the ideas proposed were to shoot up U.S. schools or fake the crash of an American commercial airliner, create a NASA disaster that would kill John Glenn, an American hero, blame it on Cuba. Right, this is what we call a false flag. A false flag operation is when you carry it out yourself, but you prepare it in advance to make it look like your enemy did it. And the rush to know the answers, the rush to get revenge, American people will take the easiest and most obvious answer to what happened and rush out and try to exact their revenge. So if you set it up such a way any of these things happen, it has Cuban fingerprints on it at all, uh, you could now, and this is in the 60s, and our effort there is to get rid of Castro. Okay. So a false flag can be against any country that you have an agenda against. In your mind, I want you to be thinking about the Spanish-American War. Our enemy is not Cuba then. Our enemy was Spain, but it's all about Cuba. This is about, in the 60s, our attempt to get rid of Castro and justify an invasion of Cuba. So it was all about setting up a false flag that would blame Cubans and by extension blame Castro and his government and give us an excuse to go in and invade and take over Cuba, which was really our goal. This all happened on March 13th, 19. This is the genesis of the plan. It wasn't proposed to Kennedy till 63, but the General Lyman Lemnitzer, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this guy was JFK inherited from Eisenhower, proposed Operation Northwoods for the first time to JFK's Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara. And the purpose was to justify a U.S. invasion of Cuba. That's what we call false flag. Now, McNamara is the first line filter, so to speak. Eventually, in 63, they make this presentation to Kennedy himself. Kennedy laughs it out. He says, "This is crazy." I thought, no. He says no, flatly. And so as far as we know, and Operation Northwoods was rejected. But if you understand what Operation Northwoods is, understand it's an attack against American citizens on American soil. And the more prominent the American citizen, like John Glenn, the more likely that the false flag will get the desired result. And if you spin it forward to November 22, 1963, is there a more prominent target? Is there a more prominent American citizen to target than the President of the United States, who was shot and killed on American territory and immediately blamed on Cuba? Immediately blamed on a patsy named Lee Harvey Oswald who had connections to Cuba. So, though I don't know this for sure, my suspicion is that though Kennedy himself shot down the, no pun intended, rejected the Operation Northwoods, my contention is a couple months later, Operation Northwoods took place anyway without his approval. By this point, folks, they've committed so many acts of treason. What's one more? And we'll get into it, but he has become a real obstacle to all their plans, and especially in relation to its desire to take over Cuba. Kennedy is standing in the way. And so what better target, what more prominent American target than a U.S. president? And what more convenient false flag opportunity than to blame it, the assassination of a U.S. president, on Cuba? And of course, they're going to talk about how Lee Harvey Oswald was a pro-Castro agitator. He had just returned from the Cuban embassy down in Mexico City. They laid all this through its media-controlled press at the feet of the American people to hopefully justify a war against Cuba so that we could invade and take over Cuba. Now, unfortunately for them, Vietnam got in the way because that pretty quickly got put on the front pages, and that replaced Cuba as the new war. And but anyway, my contention is that Operation Northwoods did happen on November 22, 1963, but without Kennedy's approval. And anyway, you say, well, what's this got to do with the Spanish-American War? Well, let's continue on with this paperwork. These are all documents straight from the CIA. In this Operation Northwoods presented to Kennedy in 63, they lay out certain recommendations. For example, recommendations 1 and 2, when being specific about these false flag attacks, they said, well, One could be harassment plus deceptive actions to convince the Cubans that a U.S. invasion was imminent. Another could be a series of well-coordinated incidents that are planned to take place in and around the U.S. Marine base at Guantanamo to give the genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. These well-coordinated incidents, they specify, they went through a list. They said we could spread rumors, in other words, propagandize the use of radio. We could conduct over-the-fence attacks by land-friendly Cubans. Over the fence means aimed across the fence line at our forces in Guantanamo. It could include the capture of Cuban saboteurs who are really our people, but they're stooges being used by us so that we can blame it on the Cubans. In other words, that we're going to capture Cuban saboteurs at Guantanamo, or we're going to use these friendly Cubans that are working for us to start riots near the base. Or we're going to use these friendly Cubans to blow up ammunition dumps inside the base, start fires. They're going to sabotage by burning aircraft on the base. They're going to lob mortar shells from outside the base onto the base, damaging installations, etc., etc. In other words, we're going to have these Cuban assets that are on our payroll. They're working for us, but because they're Cuban, when it's over and they get caught, we blame it on them. We can very easily blame it on Cuba itself. No one's going to know that they're working for us. These well-coordinated incidences include the capture of these friendly Cuban assault teams approaching from the sea or the vicinity of Guantanamo City, ostensibly on their way to attack Guantanamo base. The capture of a militia group, which was attempting to storm the base, the sabotage of a ship in the harbor through the use of large fires or naphthalene, the sinking of a ship near the harbor entrance. It will even go so far to fool the American people. And of course, the American yellow press will be involved in this to conduct mock funerals for mock victims, all in an effort to deceive the American. This is all a false flag. This is all in the CIA documents of how we might achieve this. And of course, the U.S. response to any of the above would be, quote, offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, the destruction of artillery and mortar emplacements, which threatened the base, followed by this is the key word here, a large-scale U.S. military operations. In other words, an invasion of Cuba. That's the ultimate objective here. Now, so far, you're probably wondering, what in the world are you talking about Operation Northwoods for? None of this has anything to do with the Spanish-American War. I mean, you can make an argument that the sinking of a ship near the harbor entrance, you know, that's a strategy that's been employed. But this is in 1963. What happened in Cuba in 1897, 98, this is long before this document was ever produced. So what does one have to do with the other? All right. Then we get to recommendation 3. Recommendation 3 is a, quote, remember the main incident. Could be arranged in several forms. Blow up a ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Blow up a drone or an unmanned vessel anywhere in Cuban waters. And of course, the response would be the U.S. could follow up with air-sea rescue operations covered by U.S. fighters to, quote, evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. And we could publish the casualty list in U.S. newspapers. In other words, the documents, the CIA documents, are claiming, and of course, in their proposal, as they're talking to McNamara and later to Kennedy, this recommendation 3 is expounded upon. I heard McNamara discussing it. In fact, I think he wrote about it in his book, about how they claimed, as they were presenting this, that it worked so well in 1898. That's why they referenced it. They remember the main incident. In other words, we want to do, this is a third recommendation. If recommendations 1 and 2 don't suit your purposes, you don't think it's sufficient, recommendation 3, we blow up an American naval ship, kill a bunch of American soldiers, blame in 60, we're going to blame Cuba to get rid of Castro. But in 1898, we blamed Spain to justify a war against Spain. And McNamara says that they said, well, it worked so well in 1898, uh, we feel like it would work again 70 years later. In other words, they are saying that the sinking of the U.S. Maine was a contrived incident. It was a false flag. It was the final step in a long ongoing process to gin up enough anger and hostility of the American people towards the Spaniards justify a war. We primed the pump with the media, using all the propaganda in the media. And the American people began to be very unsettled by what was going on in Cuba at the hands of the Spaniards. And then we published that letter calling the Spanish ambassador calling the American president a weak and stupid politician. And that caused the Americans to begin to get angry and to think, maybe maybe it is justified for us to go in and set things right in Cuba, go after Spain. And then, boom, right on the heels of that, we sink the USS Maine. Now 266 American servicemen are dead. And our ship is at the bottom of the harbor. And we got egg all over our face, at least as far as the world is concerned. Everybody's wondering, what's America going to do about this? Well, and the media is blaming Spain. The government's blaming Spain. The pump has been primed sufficiently so the American people are blaming Spain. And the desired result was on April 19th, 1898, we declared war. In other words, all these things were a psyop up until the USS Spain was blown up. And then that was an actual false flag to push the American people over the top. And we have in the CIA's own documents that this was a ginned up false flag attack that got us into our first foreign war. That's why I say we've crossed the line now into treason. Because this is an attack. This is a betrayal of the American people. We've lied to the American people, and the government's involved in this now. It's not just the media anymore. The government's participating in this, according to their own documents, betraying the American people, attacking American people. Right? 266 Americans died in this. And then when we get into, as a result of this, we get into a war, and more Americans died in the war. So this is treason. And if you trace it all back, it goes back to the original power elites, these industrialists, these robber barons who wanted Cuba so we could grow our sugarcane there. We had complications in Cuba that we didn't have in Hawaii. Hawaii was easy. No one else, no third party was involved in that. It was just us and Queen Lily. This is difficult. This is different. We've got to finesse this a little bit differently. We used propaganda. We used our assets in the press. We faked a letter. We got the American people all ginned up, and then we launched a false flag attack, killing a bunch of Americans, sacrificing them. Remember now, these industrialists, these power elites, they don't care about the public interest. They don't care about these unfit people. They're pawns in a larger game. These 266 people that got sacrificed, and then later in the war, however many men died in the war itself, they're just pawns in a larger game. The ultimate objective here is to maximize profits. And the way you do that is you get your hands on Cuba because you've got A, access to raw materials, and B, you got access to export markets, in addition to any number of things. And of course, those folks that are behind the scenes pulling these strings, like Geppetto, are completely immunized from any recrimination. They can plot to blow up the world. It never comes back on them. We don't learn about this until the church hearings in 1975. So almost 80 years later, we learned that the Remember the Maine was contrived. It was a false flag. And it worked. Here are some of the places that I've referenced. I've circled them or put red boxes around. If you go down to the bottom right, that's the Remember the Maine incident. And so I've highlighted these. Other ideas were to shoot down hijacked American planes, gunned down and bombed civilians in the streets of Washington, D.C. and Miami. Miami was the largest Cuban population in America. Washington, D.C. obviously is our government. And this would all be done by our Cuban assets so that we could blame Cuba. This is in the 60s, right? Because our effort is to get rid of Castro. What this does, it shows a couple things. And it goes on. There was a recommendation for here, develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area or DC aimed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the U.S. In other words, when Cubans get in boats and try to flee Cuba in 63 and come to America, we'll sink the boats and we'll blame Castro. We'll foster attempts, we'll try to kill people, Cuban refugees that do make it to America, we'll blame Castro. There was even an idea to put plastic bombs that could be attributed to Castro in Miami shopping malls to maximize, inflict maximum damage. And of course, the U.S. response is always the same in the 63 idea, Operation Northwoods, which was to arrest these Cubans, to publicize that this is a Castro-led operation, and then prepare an invasion of Cuba. Now, what Operation Northwoods shows in 1975 is that our government has actively done this in the past. As crazy as this operation sounds to Kennedy, it's being presented to him like it's never been done before. But its own documents show, hey, we've done this before and it's worked. It's, you want some assurances that an operation is going to succeed. So in the process of explaining or proposing this new plan, they're saying, hey, they're referencing times they used it in the past and it worked. The USS Maine worked. It got us in a war. So it shows that our government has committed treason before against the American people, all the way back to the Spanish-American War. And they are not past doing it again, another false flag, this time to get us into Cuba and get rid of Castro. In 1898, the enemy was Spain, and we had to get rid of Spain so we could get our hands on Cuba. In 1963, our enemy is Castro. We're going to have to take out Castro somehow and set up these false flags to get the American people to support a war against Cuba and Castro. It's the same thing. And by referencing the USS Maine, they give away the fact that they've already done it before. So if you go back to what we were discussing and all these events leading up, this is the beginning of the crossing of the Rubicon from treachery into treason. And remember now the motive. The motive was by these, we didn't have an enemy in Cuba named Fidel Castro at that time. The U.S. government would be upset at. The target was to get rid of the Spanish so we could go into Cuba and take over just like we did in Hawaii so we could grow sugarcane, make lots of money. And there's built-in labor down there with all these Cubans. They're huge population of unfit. So we win. It's a win-win proposition. We got these unfit to do all the work. We got the perfect place, the natural resources, the raw materials, the tropical temperatures to grow all this sugar cane. And then after we grow it, we can turn around and sell it back to the Cubans, and now we have more export markets. I mean, this is when these power elites, these 50 or 60 men that are running our country and our country's economy and our government, are now pulling strings, committing treason against the American people so they can get their hands on more profits. This is a template you're going to see going forward, time and time again. The pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. And it started the Spanish-American War. So, according to CIA's own documents, which of course the CIA didn't exist back in 1898. What the CIA is referencing is that this happened before the U.S. government participated in this, obviously, if it's a U.S. naval ship. And it worked so well, we are proposing it again here in 1963. And of course, we're going to find out it happened other times. And after 63, it happens again. Up to, and I would maintain it's been happening here within the last 5 years. In other words, it's a continuing thing. The false flag always works if it's preceded smartly with enough propaganda that it's believable. You have to make it believable. We'll talk about when we get to the Kennedy assassination, all the extensive operation to sheepdip Lee Harvey Oswald in advance of the assassination to make him a Cuban Castro stooge, so that when the assassination happens and he is the patsy, the fall guy, it's totally believable. He was part of he went to the Cuban embassy trying to go to Cuba. He went to Russia. He was a communist, self-proclaimed Marxist. He was running the Castro committee down there in Fair Play for Cuba committee in New Orleans. He was seen handing out leaflets all over New Orleans, pro-Castro leaflets. All of this was staged. And it was with the idea that when we launched this false flag, this Operation Northwoods on November 22, and 17 minutes later, we have our suspect and we release his name to the American public. We have this cover story to drop on the American people using our controlled media to run this psyop on the American people. And the end result, hopefully, is an invasion, justified invasion of Cuba. Like I said, Vietnam intervened, and we ended up in a different war, 9,000 miles away instead of 90 miles away. But that was the point of it. That was the purpose. And it turns out it's happened before. Okay, that was a little longer today, but I wanted to explain that this is a crucial moment. The Spanish-American War in our history, it's our first foreign war. And to get American support, it turns out it didn't happen organically like we thought. It was contrived. It was a psyop. There was propaganda. There was a fake letter, which is more propaganda, but you're basically manufacturing evidence, right? And then there's a false flag attack. And by that time, the American people were primed and off to war we went. And those that were involved in this took notes and said, wow, that worked so well, we can do it again. And we learned, they learn from their mistakes. They make improvements along the way. And for 80 years, the American people don't know anything about it. And then all of a sudden in 75, when the church hearings happen and these documents get dumped, we're reading back, we're like, holy cow. Remember the Maine was contrived. It was a false flag. It was intentional. We did it. We blew up our own ship, killed our own people. That's treason. It led to a war which killed more of our American own people. Why? So we could get our hands on the goodies. And you'll see what we mean as we get into the war itself. Okay, that's enough for today. Please subscribe to my channel. Please smash the like button and feel free to share or comment. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.